Okay, so that's the math, and I couldn't understand, if the math was so obvious, why were all the car companies getting away from electric cars and talking about other things. So, in 2003, this is what people thought of when they thought of electric cars. These were not the kind of cars that inspired people to go buy a car. They were small, they were ugly, and they were not inspiring in the slightest. There had been electric cars produced by the large car manufacturers in California up until the year 2002. These were produced in order to meet the requirements of California's zero emissions mandate, a law that required the car makers to sell a very small number of electric cars in order to continue selling also gasoline cars in California. The car companies did not put their best effort into making great cars. Instead, they put their effort into lobbying to get this zero emissions mandate removed. And they succeeded. In 2003, the zero emissions mandate was gutted, and 100% of the electric cars that were on the market in California were taken off the market. If you had the misfortune of owning a General Motors EV1 electric car, they came and took all of those cars back and crushed them. What General Motors said is there simply was not enough customers to make a viable business for General Motors. What they said was the car never had an appeal beyond a core group of technology enthusiasts and environmentalists. I think that's right. These cars did not appeal to anyone else. And I thought about what were appealing cars in that time frame. What the American public wanted was not those ugly cars I showed you a minute ago. What they wanted was something a little different. Something like this. These were the cars that inspired people to go and buy a new car. Very, very different idea than what was being sold as electric cars. And it comes down to image. The image of the electric car was one thing, and the image that we lusted after was something entirely different. Now, fair enough, there were some very smart people that were buying high-efficiency cars. But that is not the image of what the American car buyer wanted. And I looked at this and thought, can we put these two together? Is it possible? Let's call it the Porscheus. This is a car for people, on the one hand, who love cars, but on the other hand, for people who do care about the environment. Okay, here's what happens with Photoshop, right? So the first crazy idea behind the founding of Tesla was to revive the electric car by making a sexy electric sports car, something that had never been done before. Now, the common complaint about electric cars has always been the driving range. It's not practical to own a car that only has a 50 or 75 kilometer range. And the range is, of course, all about the batteries. When I looked at electric cars in the year 2003, I realized that almost every electric car made was still using lead-acid batteries, the same kind of batteries that had been in electric cars for 100 years. And this is the reason the cars were heavy, they didn't go very far, and they didn't last very long. My experience with consumer electronics, with the Rocketbook, led me to understand that the new chemistry of lithium-ion changed the equation entirely. The lithium-ion battery carries a lot more energy and has a lot longer life. And so the second crazy idea behind Tesla was to fix the range problem using consumer electronic batteries, using really the same batteries that were used in laptop computers and camcorders and the like. There is one single standardized cell size being made by many producers around the world. There was something like 2 billion of these cells being made every single year, and this was putting constant pressure on the price and constant pressure on the capacity and quality. So with these two ideas, I started Tesla Motors, and this was half of Tesla Motors at one point. The other half is the guy holding the camera. So here's my next concept for innovation, which is to be bold. And I say maybe even a little naive. I think that if I had truly understood how difficult it was to start a car company, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But on the other hand, I think the hard problems are by far the interesting ones. Okay, so I didn't know very much about the car industry, and I started off by learning, by reading everything I could about how cars are made, how they're sold. I learned what it takes to make a safe car and one that can legally be sold on the road. I looked for a partner, And I found one in Lotus Cars in the UK to build the automotive portion of the car, to build the chassis and body for our first car. We spent a lot of time studying how to fit this very different drivetrain, this big battery pack, the motors, the electronics, into a car that had traditionally had a gasoline engine and gas tanks and so forth. And by this winter of 2003, we had completed our first business plan. Now in Silicon Valley, business plans are very old-fashioned. A typical startup company, when they're raising money, will just write a PowerPoint presentation and raise money with just that. And maybe that's acceptable, that's probably all that today's investors will look at. But I think a business plan is very important for the entrepreneur because it forces you to think the idea all the way through. You have to not only have an idea of your product, but how you're going to have that manufactured, and eventually how you're going to turn that into a profitable business. So my next concept here is that I think it's critical at the starting phase of a company to think the idea all the way through, to write a real business plan, even if it's only for you, because eventually you need to get over the naivety, perhaps, that got you into the startup in the first place. So, with that business plan, we began fundraising in Silicon Valley, and we managed to close our first round of fundraising in April of 2004 of about $7.5 million. This was led by the famous Elon Musk, as well as a couple of Silicon Valley venture capitalist firms. And with that, we began hiring people and began the hard work of designing a car. We held a styling competition between several automotive stylists to choose who was going to do the design work for our car, and began designing. This is a photo of the early styling for the first Tesla car. This is a quarter-scale clay model. It's about that big lump of clay. And once this shiny Dynoc material is put on, it starts to look like a real car. With that, we raised our second round of funding, again with a series of venture capital firms, as well as from some of the original investors. The winter of 2004 was an upset for us. This is when there were several news reports about fires caused by lithium-ion batteries in laptop computers. And this caused us to completely rethink the idea about safety for batteries. We realized that what the manufacturers of these batteries had told us about the safety was not perhaps true. And it caused us a setback in our schedule, and it caused us to completely redesign the battery. But the idea I had was that if we can take 40 liters of highly flammable liquid and put it into a gasoline-powered car and make that safe somehow, then we should be able to do the same thing with batteries. And with hard work and with some time, that is the case. And this brings me to my next concept, and that is that you need to face reality when these problems occur, and face them as soon as possible. It's nice to wish that they'll go away, it's nice to pretend that it doesn't exist, but the sooner you face the problem and solve it, the better off you are. We opened an office on the Lotus campus in the UK, and this allowed us to hire, for the first time, a significant number of engineers with direct automotive experience. This was at a time when Lotus was having a redundancy and was laying off engineers, and so we simply hired them. Lotus made it a condition of doing business that we adopt their formal new product introduction process. This was a process that described not only manufacturing, but also the engineering side of the company, marketing, even sales and finance. And this is something that was not at all normal for the way Silicon Valley operates, and we didn't like this. We hated this process in the beginning. In hindsight, looking back, this requirement from Lotus was probably one of the best things that happened to our company, because it forced us to grow up. It forced us to go from a bunch of guys with a crazy idea and turn ourselves into a real car company that actually could produce cars. And this is a concept I think is important for startup companies to remember, that to build the company too. It's easy to stay focused on the product you're building, but it's just as important to build the company. Here's a picture of the full-size scale model. This is still in clay, but when it's covered with this Dynoc material, it looks surprisingly like a real car. That was several tons of clay, and was the first time we got to see in full scale what the car would look like. We made another model. This is an aerodynamic buck. It was used for tuning in a wind tunnel. We spent a lot of time working on our drivetrain, working on the motors, working on the electronics, and working on the battery system. And this is our first mule that looked like the real car. This is a mule is a car that looks like the final car, but everything is handmade and covered with just to look like a real car. It was drivable. It was a beautiful car. And in fact, this mule found its way for a brief moment in a movie about electric cars. By the spring of 2006, we were making evaluation prototypes. These cars are drivable cars that are very much like a production car. They're only just handmade. And with that, we raised our next round of fundraising from a variety of Silicon Valley investors, as well as from some of the previous investors. And after building a couple of these evaluation prototypes, we had a public launch of this car. We had a large event in Santa Monica, California, and invited hundreds of people to come and see our car, and not only see them, but drive them. We had a big tent with a party, and the cars came through the party, and everybody got to get in and go for a drive. We built a couple more of these evaluation prototypes, and these were much shorter lived. This car cost us about $350,000. It drove a total of about 10 miles. And it was destroyed in less than 1 second. Very painful. Somewhere about this time is when we began to realize we were having troubles with the transmission. The transmission in electric cars is actually extremely simple. There's no reason why it should be difficult. The trouble was that the companies who made transmissions had no interest in making them for such a small company, and indeed for an electric car in a time when everybody knew that electric cars didn't work. So we had troubles with this thing, and it took us a long time to resolve them. And this is maybe a recap of what I say about facing reality. It took us too long to realize that our vendor for these transmissions was not going to succeed. We showed our cars at the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance in California to a huge audience. And we spent a lot of time doing the various kinds of testing necessary to take a prototype and turn it into a real car. This is durability testing and all kinds of different abuse testing. We opened a plant in Taiwan to manufacture our motors. The motor was designed by ourselves, but many of the components for that motor came from Taiwan, so this seemed like a logical place to build the motors. We also opened an office near Detroit in Michigan, allowing us finally to hire American automotive talent. And so by this time, we had our office in Silicon Valley. We had our office in the UK with our English engineering team. We had the Taiwan office building motors, and we had now an office in Michigan. And I made a point of exchanging people. So people from the UK came to California, people from California went to Taiwan, some of other people went to Michigan, and the idea was to take these different groups of people and bring them together and make one team. And so this brings me to the next concept, which is it's critical to hire the best people. You need to have a balance in your team of smart people, people with direct experience, and passion. We showed our car at the San Francisco Auto Show and to the LA Auto Show. This is our then Governor Schwarzenegger having a look at the car. Winter of 2006, we did some really interesting testing in the Arctic Circle in Sweden. This is for cold weather performance and traction tuning and the like. Began making production tools so we could go into production. And the first one was finished in the spring of 2007. This allowed us to raise our next round of fundraising. This was a $45 million round from a variety of venture capital firms and more investment from the original investors.